Hearing that John had been arrested, he withdrew to Galilee, and leaving Nazareth, he went and settled in Capernaum, beside the lake, on the borders of Zebulun and Naphtali. From then onwards, Jesus began his proclamation with the message, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is close at hand."
We are in Capernaum, on the northwest shore of Lake Tiberias. There have been excavations in this village for 100 years. Why so much interest in this village? A sign we erected at the entrance to the ruins reads, Capernaum, the town of Jesus. Perhaps no other village has as many mentions in the Gospel as this one. It is a fact that Matthew, who was from Capernaum, says that upon leaving Nazareth, Jesus went to live in Capernaum. In Greek, he made his home there. Capernaum, which lay along the Via Maris, the main ancient route connecting Egypt and Damascus, was a highly frequented town. This explains the presence of a detachment of soldiers under the jurisdiction of the centurion mentioned by the Gospels. Being a frontier town between the two regions ruled by Herod's sons, Capernaum had a customs house. Here the publican Matthew exercised his profession before becoming a disciple of Jesus. Here we found a milestone. It was believed, for example, that the road to Damascus passed by Tabgha toward the north, but now we know it passed through Capernaum.
As he was walking along by the Lake of Galilee, he saw Simon and Simon's brother Andrew casting a net in the lake, for they were fishermen. And Jesus said to them, "Come after me, and I will make you into fishers of people." And at once they left their nets and followed him.
During his 3 years of itinerant preaching in Galilee, after he had called the 12 apostles to follow him, Jesus made Capernaum his home and the base for his public ministry. Jesus was legally considered a resident of Capernaum. In fact, it was here that he was approached by the collectors of the temple tax.
And at once on leaving the synagogue, he went with James and John straight to the house of Simon and Andrew. Now Simon's mother-in-law was in bed and feverish, and at once they told him about her. He went in to her, took her by the hand, and helped her up. And the fever left her, and she began to serve them.
The excavations conducted by the Franciscans in the early 20th century led to the discovery of an elegant building with polychrome mosaic flooring dating from the end of the 5th century. The structure consisted of 2 concentric octagons and an outer semi-octagon serving as an ambulatory. The identification of this building as a church was confirmed with certainty in 1968, when Father Virgilio Corbo identified the apse facing east and, inside, a baptismal font. It was then a question of determining whether this Byzantine building, used by the Christian community, was the place described by the anonymous pilgrim from Piacenza in 570.
And so we came on to Capernaum, to the house of St. Peter, which is now a basilica.
We removed the mosaics with the peacock, for example, the one that was in the central octagon, and the surprises began. An enormous amount of plaster fragments beneath the mosaic. There was the fill laid to rise above the previous level. We have a church on top of another church. And this is another point, a link with the earlier period. From the Byzantine Church of the late 5th century, we go back toward the 4th century. In the 4th century, there was most certainly a structure here, which today we call, somewhat pompously, Domus Ecclesia, that is, a house used as a church, as a place of worship. It is a square room with sides about 6 meters long, divided into two by a central arch, which was repeatedly plastered and decorated with paint. Signs of visits by pilgrims centuries ago. 165 graffiti are today preserved in the Museum of the Flagellation, and they provide evidence that the Byzantine architects deliberately built the central octagon of their church exactly upon the site of a previous, highly frequented Christian place of worship. The venerated room was physically separated from the rest of the village by means of a solidly built wall 112 meters long, which enclosed it on 4 sides. Access to the inside was provided by 2 small doors. A vestibule with lime flooring on the east side and a small connecting hall marked the entrance to the venerated room. The whole complex, which formed a proper sanctuary, was visited and described by the pilgrim Egeria at the beginning of the 5th century.
At Capernaum, the house of the Prince of the Apostles, St. Peter, has become a church, but the walls of the house are still standing as they were in the past.
She says that Peter's house was changed into a church. She adds, but its walls are still as they were in the past. This is truly precious. Exactly as we ourselves found, that is, the floors were rebuilt and covered. The walls remained intact, so much so that on these walls we later found several layers of plaster, among them pieces of plaster with graffiti, with decorations. Therefore, it has now been ascertained that what we found was the traditional House of Peter. The conversion of the venerated room into a church had already begun centuries before Egeria's time. From the end of the 1st century, the original floor of stone and packed earth was covered with at least 6 layers of white lime. This is judged to be a sign of the special attention paid particularly to this room, which can be precisely dated thanks to elements found between the layers. We suggest that as early as the 1st century after Christ, or no later than the 2nd century, this house began to enjoy a particular veneration, an interest on the part of a community we know through literary sources, the Judeo-Christians of this area. From some ancient Jewish documents, and based on a strong tradition that endured up to the Middle Ages, we learn that Capernaum was the dwelling place of a group of Jews known as Minim, heretics in the eyes of Orthodox Judaism, with which they had broken in order to pursue a Christian way of life. It was probably these first followers of Christ who handed down the memory of the house of Simon Peter during the first 4 centuries of the Christian era. First we began digging outside, and we found 3 stone pavements, one on top of the other. The same thing in the Sacra Insula, that is, the insula where Peter's house is traditionally located. Again, we have the 3 stone pavements, one atop the other. And these floors, with ceramics, are definitely 1st century. And beneath the oldest floor, we are in a period even before Christ, the Hellenistic period. Beneath the foundations of the octagonal church and the walls of the Judeo-Christian sanctuary, 6 closed rooms were identified, including the venerated room, with typical stone-paved floors around an open courtyard, and stairs and a furnace, as was customary. People entered through a door whose basalt stone threshold is still visible and well preserved. So we enter from the east, cross a threshold, and around us there are houses that may very well have been used by different families. One of these houses is that little room we call the Venerated Room. Only Mark speaks of this door.
When he returned to Capernaum, some time later, word went round that he was in the house. And so many people collected that there was no room left, even in front of the door. He was preaching the word to them when some people came, bringing him a paralytic, carried by 4 men. But as they could not get the man to him through the crowd, they stripped the roof over the place where Jesus was. And when they had made an opening, they lowered the stretcher on which the paralytic lay.
When we talk about that paralytic lowered from the roof, no. Luke, who comes from the world of the Gentiles, speaks of roof tiles. Here we found not even half a tile. Mark, by contrast, does not say anything at all about roof tiles. They removed the roof, and we may say easily, these were only very light roofs, easy to uncover, to remove, even if there was someone underneath. A glass floor inside the present memorial enables today's visitors to enter the venerated room from above, to relive the gospel episodes that took place there. All around, the view is dominated by the suggestive ruins of the ancient village of Capernaum.
They went as far as Capernaum, and at once on the Sabbath he went into the synagogue and began to teach. And his teaching made a deep impression on them, because he taught them with authority.
The spectacular ruins of the White Synagogue, just north of the octagonal basilica, do not belong, as had been supposed in the early 20th century, to the synagogue where Jesus used to cure and teach. However, the synagogue described in the Gospel, the one built by the pagan centurion, of which Jairus was one of the chiefs, and in which Jesus promised the Eucharist in his famous Sermon on the Bread of Life, is located on the same site. Excavations have revealed the large basalt stone floor, measuring 20 by 8 meters, at a depth of about 2 meters below the present nave. The same survey, based on the finds and a treasure of 40,000 coins recovered from below the floors, established that the monumental White Synagogue was built in the 5th century, more or less in the same period as the Byzantine Church. The last great transformation of the synagogue may be dated to no earlier than 470, because all the latest coins point to this date. The sculpted capitals, the friezes of the cornices, the variety of figures and ornamentation are a wealth beyond comparison. The building rose to a height of 2 stories and included a large prayer hall divided into aisles by a stylobate, a triportico added on the east side, and an independent balcony on the side oriented toward Jerusalem, where the most refined architecture was to be found. Along the interior plaster-coated walls there are masonry benches for sitting and, near the entrance doors, architectonic niches for the scrolls of the Scriptures and the chair of Moses, elements of which are now exhibited in the archaeological area. The basalt stone wall at the foundation of the prayer hall, visible on the west side near the cobblestone street, may correspond to the basement of a synagogue building coming between the one built by the centurion and the late 5th century Byzantine synagogue, to which the following passage from Egeria seems to refer.
There, near the house church, is also the synagogue, where the Lord cured a man possessed by the devil. The way in is up many stairs, and it is made of dressed stone.
Through the excavations, we have been able to reconstruct, I won't say all, but a good part of the history of Capernaum, which is very long. Indeed, just a few steps from here, we have buildings with well-preserved floors, where we have found coins dating from the 15th century AD. So, on the one hand, we have findings from the 3rd millennium before Christ, up to the 15th century after Christ. And we also have an almost uninterrupted succession, especially in the Roman period, which we are most interested in, up to the period of the 10th, 11th century AD. The 12 living quarters, brought to light thanks to the work of archaeologists, allow us to reconstruct the community life of the village and its numerous activities. Domestic activities, whose normal setting was the courtyards of dwellings shared by several families. Crafts, including the production of glass, ceramics and stone utensils. Farming, with abundant wheat fields, palm groves and olive orchards. Trade, with export and import products. Industry, with oil presses and mills. We found this truly impressive structure, that is, a public oil press. Because, in addition to the system of the millstone, on the east side we found a whole complex of rooms where each owner arrived at the public oil press and put his sack there, and later collected the oil as suited him. Many gospel episodes here find a real impressive backdrop that makes them unexpectedly contemporary in the visitor's eyes. Even the Pope, when he came here, John Paul II, was impressed. I could see it. I accompanied him right here, and he himself told us, "Continue the excavations." I said to him, "Your Holiness, you are the first successor of Peter to have seen with your own eyes these steps, that oven, that wall, that threshold.